We're in 2 Thessalonians 2. We're looking at the second part of verse 10 through verse 12, dealing with the destruction of those who follow the man of sin, or the son of perdition. And we're told in verse 10 that they would perish. Doesn't mean that they would cease to exist, but that they would face utter ruin or devastation. But then we got down to verse 11. And for this cause God shall send them strong delusion that they should believe a lie. This seems, on the surface, to be inconsistent with the very nature of God. Doesn't God want us to be saved? Somebody turn over to 1 Timothy 2 and read verses 4 through 6. Talking about God here, who will have all men to be saved. Well, this sounds like, here in 2 Thessalonians, that God doesn't want all men to be saved. But he does. This isn't a contradiction or anything. He did the same thing with Pharaoh. When men do not love the truth, then God shall send them error and false doctrine so that they can believe what they want to believe, what they desire. A lie, since it's not the truth. The problem is they loved the lie and not the truth. God does give them free rein to believe what they want. And we'll see that in a few verses in a minute. But God is giving them over to evil, the evil that they have deliberately chosen. It's their choosing, though. Someone read Isaiah chapter 66, verses 3 and 4. And 4.
He that killeth an ox is as if he slew a man. He that sacrificeth a lamb as if he cut off a dog's head. He that offereth an oblation as if he offered swine's blood. He that burneth incense as if he blessed an idol. Yea, they have chosen their own way, and their soul delighteth in their abomination. I also will choose their delusions and will bring their fears upon them. Because when I called, none did answer. When I spake, they did not hear. But they did evil before mine eyes, and chose that in which I delighted not.
Did you get that last phrase? They chose what I delighted not. Now, that first part may seem odd. In the first part of verse 3, he that killeth an ox as if he slew a man. What is he talking about?
Sounds like they didn't really share.
Okay, they didn't, it goes beyond they didn't really care. They made no distinction between anything that would be holy and that which would be unholy. Is a man the same as an ox? Well, of course not. God has made man in his own image. Well, if we are made in the image of God, then there is a sacredness to man. But here's people who, they don't consider it any difference in killing a man and killing an ox. Or sacrificing a lamb as if he cut off a dog's neck. They make no distinction about anything. He that offer an oblation as he that offers swine's blood. Now then, think back to the Jews and what they thought of swine. And he's saying, he that offer an oblation, what's an oblation? Tribute? A sacrifice would be more along the lines. It is an offering to God. But they would consider swine's blood the same as, for example, lamb's blood. During the intertestamental period, the Maccabees in particular, led by Judas Maccabeus, brought about a revolt based upon the fact that, I believe it was the Seleucids, offered a pig on the altar. That was as Daniel called it, the abomination of desolation. Could not do anything that was more to desecrate the altar. Yet Isaiah is talking about, here's people who see no difference in it.
One thing too, like the way people come to worship serve people, Christians, they come dressed just as if they're going to a rock concert, or they're going to a costume contest.
We have in the religious world, and it's made its way into the church as well, made no distinction whatsoever in the things of this world and the things that are of sacred nature. She has it off. Those are Amber Alerts or other type of weather alerts. So it might happen to a few others that come through even many times when things are silenced.
I can remember they used to emphasize dress code for worship.
Yes.
Sunday morning.
It was emphasized because people recognized at that time there was a sacredness to coming to worship God.
It's like the priest and the tiger and any type of thing, but before they would come before God, they had to go wait and put on the best they had before the Spirit would.
And they had to wash in the brazen laver before they entered into the into the holy place. But we got away from that, and it's as if it doesn't matter. There's nothing special in relationship to coming to worship God. If you recall, I think it was probably November issue of Defender, I wrote about worship. But I went back to basically the thinking of those individuals who truly worship and the respect and the honor that they showed. And you see the literal terror of the Israelites, for example, in Exodus 19th chapter. So much so that Moses, as recorded in Hebrews 11, said, "I fear and quake." He was scared because God was going to be speaking to them. Now then what we do, we go slip. It done nothing special about it, is it? Well, yes, there is, or there's supposed to be. But here Isaiah is describing, they see no distinction. And so they choose their own ways. Their soul delights in the abominations. It does sound a whole lot like our society, doesn't it? And so when he called, none answered. Why do we see so many, and I'm saying not only the Lord's church, but religions in general, have such difficulty getting people to respond? Because there's no fear of God. They have no respect. They see there's no reason to come. And how many times have you heard through the years something along the lines, well, I can worship God out here in my garden as much as I can in a building. They have no concept because they've not followed God's will. They do their own choosing. That's where they want to be. And so they think God will accept it. I only talk to God when I need a favor. That's the way that most people are nowadays. Yeah. Romans 1 and verse 28. Now we should recognize Romans' first chapter and the latter part of that chapter to a great extent is going through the abominations of the Gentiles. But notice in verse 28, he says, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient. They are the ones who chose not to do God's will. They are the ones who chose not to retain God in their knowledge. So God allows them. There was, and I have no idea what this guy was religiously, but I listened to a guy talking about God and his existence to some college kids. And someone asked, "You mean God's going to send me to hell?" The gotcha question. So his response stuck with me. I can't say exactly the way he did, but he said, God loves you enough that he's not going to force you to spend time with him in heaven. He's right. Yeah, because that would be if somebody doesn't even love God and you're going to force them to spend eternity with you. God loves you enough not to force you to do that, to allow you to go your own way. Huh?
I don't think they're worried about that.
Well, no, they don't. But that would be another point. God allows them to do what they want to do. And that's what Romans 1 is saying. They didn't want to retain God in the knowledge, so God allowed them to do what they wanted to do. Gave them over to the reprobate mind. And then, let's add 2 Timothy 4 and verse 4. After Paul tells Timothy to preach the word, be instant in season, out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort with all long-suffering and doctrine, because the time's coming when they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lust shall they heap to themselves teachers having itching ears, and they shall turn away their ears from the truth and shall be turned into fables. Why? Because that's the way they wanted it. And they're going to get preachers, teachers, who will tell them what they want to hear. And now what the religious world has done by and large?
And the preacher won't do that, they'll fire him.
Well, that's true, and that's true whether it's the denominational world or the church. But in the denominational world, they just go and start another denomination. Go to some other place. Years ago, well, it was Rubel Shelley was reported as saying in the Nashville Tennessean that we have to ask people what they want so that we can provide it for them. Well, that's people heaping to themselves teachers because they have itching ears, and they're going to get a preacher to scratch their ears, and he'll thus turn their ears away from the truth because they don't want the truth. They don't love the truth, and they will believe a lie. Actually, it is they will believe the lie. It is, the definite article is there in the original. They will believe the lie. Well, the lie is the strong delusion that he's just talked about. God gives them that strong delusion. What is that? That's the lie. Because they don't love the truth. Now then, let's add that this is a judgment or a judicial act of God. As he gives the wicked over to evil that they have already chosen. A lot of times people are disturbed with God telling Israel, for example, as they enter into the promised land, you go in and destroy everyone. That mean that you had the babies destroyed? Yes. Why? Because it is a judicial act of God because of their sins. And their sins were now at that point full. Same thing with the Amalekites with Saul in 1 Samuel. Go destroy them. Don't spare anything. Not the animals, not the babies, not the king, not anything. Why? Because of what they had done in their history. And now then a judicial act of God saying it's now time for them to be destroyed as people. Brother Jerry Moffitt wrote, when these sensationalists love pleasure and despise truth, God sadly says, all right, I will let you do as you wish. I will give you an energy-filled mind of wondering and let you spend your time roaming hither and thither, swaying in the wilderness of wrong opinion and religious error. And that's really what he does, isn't it? Now then, is the denominational world really all that far from this? Have the majority of the denominational world believed the lie that salvation is by faith only and baptism has nothing to do with salvation? Why? because that's the way they want it. And thus they believe the lie. Once saved, always saved.
Of course, they're not saved, so they haven't obeyed. Some Christians live like they
Some Christians live as if they believe the doctrine of once saved, always saved. Along that line, I remember Andrew Conley, and it's similar to this and same principle. He was talking to a preaching brother that did not believe in Bible classes. And he was bragging that they had the biggest congregation that were non-Bible class congregations. And he said, no, you're not. Andrew Conley told him, no, you're not. Congregation I preach at is a lot bigger than yours. Why? Because so many of them didn't attend Bible classes. They didn't believe in it. Now then, they had them there, and they taught people but the majority of people must not believed in it. Because they didn't attend. Now, we're not talking about sick people or things like that. We're talking about people who could have, who just did not take the time to do it.
just don't hear any more lessons on sermons on hell, the dangers of hell. What's it like?
Hell? I mean, we're not supposed to preach on that anymore.
Even denominations, you don't hear that.
No, you don't hear anything about it. It's all how to win friends and influence people. Norman Vincent Pealeism. So that's... Well, and back in the, let's see, this would have been early 1800s and mid 1800s. I read a book that was written back then by a gospel preacher, and he talked about the educational aspect. A lot of people did not have education at that time. Preachers did not. They memorized things, but really all you had to do to be a good preacher is condemn everybody to hell and make them scared to death. Didn't matter where it came, whether it was in the Bible or not, as long as you scared the actions out of people that they're not supposed to be doing by preaching on hellfire and brimstone. That's all that was needed. You became a good preacher that way. Well, that wasn't all of the preachers, just like that wasn't all of the people, but that was to a great extent the preaching of the day. Just never got into the text of the Bible because a lot of the preachers couldn't even read. So what did? They got up and they were able to scorch people and make them feel the fires of hell as they sat there. The word, or that phrase, strong delusion in the King James, in the American Standard, and this is probably a better translation, is literally a working of error. Working of error. I think that's an interesting way in which he put it. Error works. It works on people's minds so that they will believe that error. How many times have we shown someone the passage, just for quick reference, Acts 2:38, repent and be baptized, every one of you, for the remission of your sins. And they don't believe it. Why? Because error has worked on them, worked on their minds, so that they refuse to believe it. A working of error. In verse, it is strong delusions, but I think working of error, that's the...
I call that working of error because they don't believe that baptism is essential to salvation.
They,
What they want to believe.
that's what they want to believe. It goes back to what they desire. And so God sends them strong delusion, or a working of error. In verse 12 then, that all may be damned, or might be damned, who believed not the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. God sends them this strong delusion, or this working of error, so they will believe the lie and literally be judged. Again, that's the way in which the American Standard puts it, that they might be judged. King James and New King James has damned. That's more of interpretation than anything else. And it is a proper outcome. King James is telling you, here's the outcome of it, of the judgment. They're damned. Those judged are those who do not, again, love the truth. They don't believe the truth. Truth doesn't matter. Now then, put that in what we hear all the time today. Well, that's your truth. My truth is something else. Well, if that's the case, if that argument is the case, that truth is, whether it's my truth or whether it's your truth, then there would never be any working of error, would there? It would just be your truth as opposed to my truth. There would be no condemnation. They wouldn't be judged, because what would they be judged upon? Your truth or my truth? Basically, that is an attack upon truth, upon the ability to know one way or the other. Try that before a judge. Get a speeding ticket out here and just go up here before the judge, and he says, well, you were going this fast and the speed limit was this. And say, well, that was just your truth. My truth is different than that. See how far that gets you? And then when he says, okay, if you want to play that, you're guilty, you have to pay this fine. And pull out a penny and say, well, there's my truth of that fine. Those things don't work, do they?
But they ain't got something in jail.
Well, they might end up putting you in jail if you do something silliness like that. And everybody knows it's stupidity. But then when they get over to other areas, all of a sudden it's fine. It's right because it's dealing with religious matters or moral matters. And yes, they do it in relationship to both of those. Try it in math. Why can't I say, well, my truth is that all of this land that Pensacola sits on is mine. Now, everybody in Pensacola needs to start giving me some money for rent. And I'll let you stay on my land. Well, that's my truth. Well, of course, that's stupidity. Because we know that truth isn't changeable like that. It is objective. It is outside of the person. I have to make sure that I know the truth, and I love the truth. The fact is that people don't love the truth, and so they come up with this idea of your truth and my truth. Now, why? Because they delight to have pleasure in unrighteousness or wickedness, which is the opposite of believing the truth. They love pleasure and despise truth. And if you don't believe that, go out and start telling the world in general that abortion is sinful. That a human life begins at the moment of conception, and to kill that one that's in the womb is murder. And see how long people put up with that. Because why? They don't love the truth. They love pleasure. And these that, and simply to use abortion as a good illustration, those who argue for abortion, and we have got to keep it, what do I always use? Well, because of the life of the mother. Sometimes that the mother's life is in danger and you have to abort the baby. How often does that happen? You know, in all of my 70 plus years, I've never heard of that taking place. Not an actual real case of it. Well, they come up with imaginary things because in reality, the reason people want abortion is because they refuse to remain chaste and pure as God demands. And so they use it as abortion as a form of, well, if I get pregnant, instead of taking something in order to prevent pregnancy, if I get pregnant, I'll just get rid of the baby. It is a handy thing. Now then, why? Because that's what they want to do. That's the way they want to live. They want to live in pleasure. They had pleasure in unrighteousness. The word pleasure, there's three Greek words that I want to mention. The first one is hedone.
What?
Hedone. You might have heard the word, probably have, hedonism. Or that person is hedonistic. What is it? That is a gratification of the natural desires. Whatever feels good, do it in a sense. That's not what Paul uses here. A second word, apolusis, is a word which means enjoyment. And that's not what he uses here. Instead, Paul uses the word eudokia. Now then, let me break this word up. You might have heard me reference Doceticism. It was a part of Gnosticism. Doceticism, in relationship to Christ, was a view that Christ did not actually have a physical body. He was only a ghostly apparition. He only, and here's the word, dokio, seemed to be. He didn't have any real existence.
How could he ride on the ground then, being on like a body?
Dale, we're not arguing about that. So why are you bringing it up? It is, he seemed to be. It's the word seem. And then you have the prefix EU, which is good. So literally, it's made up of good seems. Whatever seems good to you is good. That's what he's really saying here. It's what seems to be good. That's the idea of pleasure. People who thought in their own mind, this is good. It becomes the philosophy of, if it feels good, do it. And Paul is saying, you know, God can't do anything with a person who has that philosophy. So God just gives him over, because they're bound and determined to do what seems to be good in their own mind. They don't care what God says. And Matthew 7 and verse 6 becomes a good passage in relationship to those types of individuals when Jesus says, "Give not that which is holy unto dogs, neither cast ye your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn again and rend you." Can't do anything with someone who has that type of a mindset. They're bound and determined to do what God or what they want, their own desires. Well, he has to change his views first. He has to reject that type of a philosophy of life and become obedient to the truth then. Brother J.W. McGarvey, in his commentary, noted that when a people desire not to do the will of God, God withdraws the knowledge of himself from them. He goes on to say, we may infer that when men wish to do only a part of his will, he permits only partial knowledge of himself to be known. This doubtless explains why so many professed Christians seem never able to see portions of the will of God. They do not desire to do it at all. They see only what they wish to see. Blindness in part has happened to those people. How many sermons through the years have you heard of attending Bible classes and attending all of the worship services? And those who need that, it falls on deaf ears. They have a blindness to God's word, a self-imposed blindness, so they will do what they want to do instead of submitting to the will of God. But I thought it interesting at the beginning of his quote that when a people desire not to do the will of God, God withdraws his knowledge of himself from them. We're told, Colossians 1:23, that the gospel was preached to every creature under heaven. Why is it that entire nations, in our day and for many centuries, had absolutely no knowledge of God or the Bible.
Yes, they didn't study it, and they studied it.
No, that's not what the reason is.
What's the reason?
They did not want to know. And God, because in history they did not want to know, and God withdrew the knowledge of himself from them. And as a result, after generation after generation of them not wanting to know or obey God's will, they ended up where they had absolutely no knowledge of God in the Bible. We see that I can think of some famous atheists. They reject God totally. Their children, think they really have any hope?
They're in that group.
They end up being in that group themselves because their parents made that choice to refuse God, to reject God. And so God, through time, withdraws himself from them. And those children who are raised in that type of an environment, they really have no choice. They're going to end up in the same condition because of their parents. Now, I'm not saying that it's 100% true, just like a child who's raised by two very faithful Christian parents doesn't mean that they will necessarily never fall away. They do. But I can guarantee you that the chances of someone remaining faithful to God goes up a great deal if both parents are faithful to God, as opposed to someone who's raised by atheists and a hatred of God. Those children, by and large, almost never will change because God withdraws his knowledge from them because they've been taught to do what they want to do. Verse 13 then. Through chapter 3 and verse 5, there's some exhortations. And no, we're not going to get started on that, but Lord willing, we'll start with verse 13 next week.